Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You are indeed tuned into KTEC 89.5 FM, Klamath Falls. And you are now listening to The Garden. This is a 1-hour show every Monday night from 8 p.m. until 9 p.m., where I, the gardener Bree, that's my name, Bree, not really called the gardener Bree. I kind of like it though. Pursue my favorite topics, all hopefully surrounding ideas of truth and beauty. Because I think truth and beauty are two of the highest topics that we can attain to in our life. If we can find truth, if we can find beauty, well, that's everything, isn't it? It really is everything. Today, I really was a gardener. I was very, very thrilled to be able to get my hands into the dirt and plant some of my pots, which have been sitting on my back porch, cracking in the cold. They're terracotta, so they were cracking throughout the winter, looking sad and sullen. Today I got a few vegetables planted. Last year I didn't do any vegetables because my abysmal failure gardening in my first year in Klamath Falls made me say, never again. But of course we always forget those never agains, don't we? So I tried this year, I'm trying pumpkin. That's an easy one, so I have high hopes. Pumpkin, tomatoes, watermelon. I'm starting it in the house nice and early. Let's see how it does. There's small watermelon, so maybe they'll do better in our short grow season than the big watermelon. And beets, which I love. And I learned that beets can be planted in the frost. So, I hope that the beets will do well out here in the desert. We'll see. But I was asking myself, I was thinking today, oh, the glorious sunshine. Oh, beautiful, beautiful springtime. How marvelous it all is. Everyone's enjoying it. You can hear the children on the street playing outside, and you can almost hear the sigh of relief coming from the whole city that springtime is finally here. And I was asking myself if we would feel this way, if we just lived in an eternal winter, like if we didn't know spring was coming, would we long for it so much? Or would we just accept the winter? I don't know the answer. I know if you hear about people who come from, say, abusive families or really dark, hard families, they always say they thought that was normal. It wasn't until they were older, or maybe they went to a friend's house a few times and they experienced something different that they first realized, that something else was possible. You just settle into you settle into what you have, don't you? But we all know spring is coming. We've experienced it every year, and so we go through all of the winter sighing for spring. And then, of course, when it does come, it's so wonderful and it's so sweet and so fabulous. So hooray, it's springtime. We can get our hands back into the dirt and start cultivating those beautiful spaces. I'm not such a great gardener. I enjoy gardening, as I'm sure you can hear. And I love, 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 love being outside. I would like to eat all 3 meals outside every day. I hate wearing shoes. I like to be barefoot. My feet are disgusting all summer long. My poor husband has to deal with that. They almost won't get clean. I do wear shoes when I go out in public, though, I have to say. I just stay home and am barefoot a lot of the time. But I'm not a great gardener, even though I enjoy it. I'm not one of those people who knows all about the flowers and knows the right way to do it in the right time. I'm very hit or miss. I don't have a lot of money to invest in it, so I just do the bare minimum what I can. Someone told me they were selling bark dust for $2 a bag at one of the gardening stores in town, so I got some. And I put it down and it made a huge difference. It looked beautiful. So I just want to encourage you, if you, like me, are not a fabulous gardener, you can do a lot with a little, and maybe it's just a little step by step every year. And hopefully your garden will ultimately, step by step, year by year, grow into a glorious little paradise where you can eat your 3 meals outside or drink your morning coffee and just soak up the sun's rays. Okay, so tonight, I don't so much have a topic as I have a reading. It came to me this week that I really wanted to read a short story from the book Phantastes by George MacDonald. This is a book that I read probably about 10 years ago-ish. I had read The Princess and Curdie and The Princess and the Goblin by George MacDonald. I even think I had read On the Back of the North Wind before I read Phantastes. And because The Princess and Curdie and The Princess and the Goblin and On the Back of the North Wind are similar stories about children having grand adventures, I had it in my mind that that's what all George MacDonald books were like. So I went into Phantastes completely blind to the subject. The full title is Phantastes, a fairy romance for men and women. And that is indeed what the book is. It's a book about a man who either has a dream or actually really goes to fairyland. But the whole book is written as if a dream. You know how dreams are always constantly changing and shifting. You can't necessarily make sense of every moment of a dream. Someone's face might change. They become a different person. Someone that you were with just isn't there anymore. You're at the beach and the next thing you know, you're in a ballroom. That's exactly what this book is like. It would be a little bit hard to put a finger on it, what the theme or what the thread is, except that he's in fairyland and he learns a lot of things. And somehow, even though it's a little bit incohesive, the book is absolutely beautiful. I remember reading it. I read it on a long-lost tablet, like as a Kindle version, and I had made lots and lots and lots of notes, and I remember just highlighting different sentences and just sitting there and chewing on these certain sentences because I thought they were just so beautiful and so poignant, and then making notes about some of the truths that you could pull out of it. And I'm sad that I don't have that tablet anymore with all that in it. And there you go. That's our current modern age where there's that old Jim Gaffigan joke that the pictures of the Disney trip are on the computer in the hallway from 2002. Yes, the notes about the George MacDonald book are on the tablet in the garbage can from 2010 or whatever. In any event, though, within the book, there are a couple of short stories. And one of the short stories, it doesn't even have a title. It was kind of haunting and strange and weird. And for whatever reason, this story came to my mind this week. And so I decided that I would read you the story for my radio broadcast today. Why? Because it's beautiful and we are pursuing truth and beauty. And I think there is some good truth in it that you can pull out for life. So the particular copy of the book I have here, it's actually my mom's book. And I was happy that she had a print copy for me to read from because, like I said, I only have a digital copy. And it's so fun to read from the real pages. But her version actually has a whole introduction in it by your favorite and mine, C.S. Lewis. It was really enjoyable to read C.S. Lewis on George MacDonald. So I'm going to just read a little bit of his introduction by way of more introduction to the book. So this is just a pull-out sentence that I thought was excellent, though. C.S. Lewis says, MacDonald's illustrates not the doubtful maxim that to know all is to forgive all, but the unshakable truth that to forgive is to know. He who loves sees. And I thought that was awesome. In my women's Bible study this week, we were chewing on the question whether you have to know someone's past intimately or know their circumstances in order to truly love and nurture them. And we went back and forth. We said, well, no, you can really love someone without knowing all about them. And that's true, you can. But of course, the more that you know someone, the more you have compassion, the more you can sort of overlook their rough edges and really love them. But this sentence really kind of turns that on its head. To know all is to forgive all. Well, a child might know everything about their parents, but they still might not want to forgive the horrific abuse, right? But the unshakable truth is that to forgive is to know. That act of forgiving gives us a glimpse into knowing that person and to having more understanding them. And then he ends it with, he who loves sees. And I guess that was a hallmark of George MacDonald's life. Apparently he had a grandmother who was very religious, Very, very, very religious, to the point of being abusive and maybe sadistic. And George MacDonald never painted her as evil and sadistic when he wrote about her in her books. He just loved everybody. He wouldn't debate with them. He wouldn't fight with them. He just wanted to be a lover of all men. And I think some of that comes out in his books and also specifically in this story. But let me go on with with C.S. Lewis on George MacDonald. He says, if we define literature as an art whose medium is words, then certainly MacDonald has no place in its first rank, perhaps not even in its second. There are indeed passages where the wisdom and, I would dare to call it, the holiness that are in him triumph over and even burn away the baser elements in his writing style. The expression becomes precise, weighty, economic, and acquires a cutting edge. But he does not maintain this level for long. The texture of his writing as a whole is undistinguished, at times fumbling. And that's definitely true. And I want to encourage my readers to read Phantastes because it's just a beautiful book. But I would have to say that's true about his writing style. It is at times fumbling. But this does not quite dispose of him, even for the literary critic. What he does best is fantasy. Fantasy that hovers between the allegorical and the mythopoeic. And this, in my opinion, he does better than any man. And I would agree. I've rarely read anything that has lifted me to a higher level than some of the things I've read from George MacDonald. So then C.S. Lewis goes on to say, it must be more than 30 years ago that I bought, almost unwillingly, for I had looked at the volume on that bookstall and rejected it on a dozen previous occasions, the Everyman edition of Phantastes. A few hours later, I knew that I had crossed into a great frontier. Now, if that's not an endorsement for you to run out and get this book, I don't know what would be. That is how it feels. Then finally, he concludes his introduction with this. The quality which had enchanted me in his imaginative works turned out to be the quality of the real universe, the divine, magical, terrifying, and ecstatic reality in which we all live. I should have been shocked in my teens if anyone had told me that what I learned to love in Phantastes was goodness. But now that I know, I see there was no deception. The deception is all the other way around, and that prosaic moralism which confines goodness to the region of law and duty, which never lets us feel in our face the sweet air blowing from the land of righteousness, never reveals that elusive form with a capital F, which, if once seen, must inevitably be desired with all but sensuous desire, the thing, in Zappo's phrase, more gold than gold. And I love that. I thought that was absolutely so beautiful. Yes, we confine goodness. We think the world, our own feelings and emotions from being small children tells us that goodness is this sterile, boring thing. It's the following of rules. It's the duty that we have to, care for the elderly, or the duty we have to feed our children. And when we confine goodness to that, we never do feel in our face the sweet air blowing from the land of righteousness, because of course goodness is so much more than that. It is the form more gold than gold. Goodness is a personality. It is Jesus himself. And that's really what you draw close to, that amazing understanding when you read George MacDonald. He takes you just that step into springtime, as we're all longing and sighing and gasping for winter to end, so that we can enter the eternal spring that our hearts are longing for, that we know is there, even if we deny it, even if we deny eternity. There's something within us that tells us there's more than this world. I was created for more than this. Things should be different. Things shouldn't be bad. Things shouldn't be painful. If it was just chaos, we wouldn't even be able to know that it was chaos, because we would be part of the chaos. We wouldn't have the mentality to reach above that chaos and understand that there could be order and there can be a great order, and there can be a great beauty. And that's what we're all longing for and reaching for when we want the more of life. And I feel like George MacDonald gives us a little peek of that, takes us that one little step further. And I think that's a very special thing. Although, I have to say, I do wonder if our culture now, if we have the ears to hear and the eyes to see it. I happened to catch on the radio today that universities across the country are offering classes in Taylor Swift. I don't want to diss on Taylor Swift. I actually like some of her music, but she is no Shakespeare. I'm not sure she warrants a whole university class. And I think that just says it all. Are we people now as a culture like C.S. Lewis who can cross into a new frontier when the door is open before us? Or will we peek through the door and not even be able to see it? The author Grace Livingston Hill often writes characters in her books who just can't see beauty because they've never even been taught to comprehend it. They didn't sit at the table and talk with their parents and find out what beauty was as children. So even as adults, it's almost as if it doesn't exist for them. And I look at our culture and I think, is that who we are now? Do we have any concept of beauty? Are we able to see it? I hope the answer is that some people can see it. That there are people who will walk through that door into the new frontier. So, without further ado, I'm going to read to you this lovely story. It's from chapter 8 of Phantastes. It doesn't have a name. If I were to give it a name myself, I would probably call it The Mirror. So there we go. The Mirror by George MacDonald. Cosmo von Wehrstahl was a student at the University of Prague. Though of a noble family, he was poor and prided himself upon the independence that poverty gives. For what will not a man pride himself upon when he cannot get rid of it? A favorite with his fellow students, he yet had no companions, and none of them had ever crossed the threshold of his lodging in the top of one of the highest houses in the old town. Indeed, the secret of much of that compliance which recommended him to his fellows was the thought of his unknown retreat, whither in the evenings he could betake himself and indulge undisturbed in his own studies and reveries. These studies, besides those subjects necessary to his courses at university, embraced some less commonly known and approved, for in a secret drawer lay the works of Albertus Magnus and Cornelius Agrippa, along with others less read and more abstruse. And yet, however, he had followed these researches only from curiosity, and had turned them to no practical purpose. His lodgings consisted of one large, low, sealed room, singularly bare of furniture, for besides a couple of wooden chairs, a couch which served for dreaming on both day and night, and a great press of black oak, there was very little in the room that could be called furniture. But curious instruments were heaped in the corners, and in one stood a skeleton, leaning half against the wall, half supported by a string about its neck. One of its hands, all of fingers, rested on the heavy pommel of a great sword that stood beside it. Various weapons were scattered about over the floor. The walls were utterly bare of adornment, for the few strange things, such as a large dried bat with wings dispread, the skin of a porcupine, and a stuffed sea mouse, could hardly be reckoned as such. But although his fancy delighted in vagaries like these, he indulged his imagination with far different fare. His mind had yet been filled with an absorbing passion, but it lay like a still twilight, open to any wind, whether the low breath that wafts but odors, or the storm that blows the great trees till they strain and creak. He saw everything as though through a rose-colored glass. When he looked from his window on the street below, not a maiden passed, but she moved as in a story, and drew his thoughts after her till she disappeared in the vista. When he walked in the streets, he always felt as if reading a tale into which he sought to weave every face of interest that went by, and every sweet voice swept his soul as with the wings of a passing angel. He was, in fact, a poet without words, the more absorbed and endangered that the springing waters were dammed back into his soul, where, finding no utterance, they grew and swelled and undermined. But this could hardly last long. Some one form must sooner or later step within the charmed circle, enter the house of life, and compel the bewildered magician to kneel and worship. One afternoon, towards dusk, as he was wandering dreamily in one of the principal streets when a fellow student roused him by a slap on the shoulder and asked him to accompany him into a back alley to look at some old armor which he had taken a fancy to possess. Cosmo was considered an authority in every matter pertaining to arms, ancient or modern. In the use of weapons, none of the students could come near him, and his practical acquaintance with some had principally contributed to establish his authority in reference to all. He accompanied him willingly. They entered a narrow alley and thence a dirty little court, where a low arched door admitted them into a heterogeneous assemblage of everything musty and dusty and old that could well be imagined. Cosmo's verdict on the armor was satisfactory, and his companion at once concluded the purchase. As they were leaving the place, Cosmo's eye was attracted by an old mirror of an elliptical shape, which leaned against the wall covered with dust. Around it was some curious carving, which he could see but very indistinctly by the glimmering light which the owner of the shop carried in his hand. It was this carving that attracted his attention, at least so it appeared to him. He left the place, however, with his friend, taking no further notice of it. They walked together to the main street, where they parted and took opposite directions. No sooner was Cosmo left alone than the thought of the curious old mirror returned to him. A strong desire to see it more plainly arose within him, and he directed his steps once more towards the shop. The owner opened the door when he knocked, as if he had expected him. He was a little old withered man with a hooked nose and burning eyes, constantly in slow, restless motion, looking here and there as if after something that eluded them. Pretending to examine several other articles, Cosmo at last approached the mirror and requested to have it taken down. "Take it down yourself, master. I cannot reach it," said the old man. Cosmo took it down carefully, when he saw that the carving was indeed delicate and costly, being both of admirable design and execution, containing withal many devices which seemed to embody some meaning to which he had no clue. This naturally, in one of his tastes and temperament, increased the interest he felt in the old mirror, so much indeed that he now longed to possess it in order to study its frame at his leisure. He pretended, however, to want it only for use, and saying he feared the plate would be of little service, as it was rather old, he brushed away a little of the dust from its face, expecting to see a dull reflection within. His surprise was great when he found the reflection brilliant, revealing a glass not only uninjured by age, but wondrously clear and perfect, should the whole correspond to this part, even for one newly from the hands of the maker. He asked carelessly what the owner wanted for the thing. The old man replied by mentioning a sum of money far beyond the reach of poor Cosmo, who proceeded to replace the mirror where it had stood. "You think the price too high?" asked the old man. "I don't know that it is too much for you to ask," replied Calvin, "but it is far too much for me to give." The old man held up his light towards Cosmo's face. "I like your look," he said. Cosmo could not return the compliment. In fact, now he looked closely at him for the first time. He felt a kind of repugnance to him, mingled with a strange feeling of doubt whether a man or a woman stood before him. "What's your name?" he continued. "Cosmo von Wehrstahl." "Aha! I thought as much. I see your father in you. I knew your father very well, young sir. I dare say in some odd corners of my house you might find some old things with his crest and cipher upon them still. Well, I like you. You shall have the mirror at the 4th part of what I asked for it, but upon one condition." "What is that?" asked Cosmo, for although the price was still great for him to give, he could just manage it, and the desire to possess the mirror had increased to an altogether unaccountable degree, since it had seemed to be beyond his reach. "That, if you should ever want to get rid of it again, you will let me have the first offer." "Certainly," replied Cosmo, with a smile, adding, "A moderate condition indeed." "On my honor? On your honor?" insisted the seller. "On my honor," said the buyer, and the bargain was concluded. "I will carry it home for you," said the old man, as Cosmo took it in his hands. No, I will carry it myself," he said, for he had a peculiar dislike to revealing his residence to anyone, and more especially to this person, to whom he felt every moment a greater antipathy. "Just as you please," said the old creature, and muttered to himself as he held his light at the door to show him out of the court. Sold for the 6th time. I wonder what will be the upshot of this. I should think my lady had enough of it by now." Cosmo carried his prize carefully home, but all the way he had an uncomfortable feeling that he was watched and dogged. Repeatedly he looked about, but saw nothing to justify his suspicion. Indeed, the streets were too crowded and too ill-lighted to expose very readily a careful spy, if there should be at his heels. He reached his lodging in safety and leaned his purchase against the wall, rather relieved, strong as he was, to be rid of its weight. Then, lighting his pipe, threw himself on the couch and was soon lapped in the folds of one of his haunting dreams. He returned home earlier than usual the next day and fixed the mirror to the wall over the hearth, at one end of his long room. He then carefully wiped away the dust from its face, and clear as the water of a sunny spring, the mirror shone out from beneath the envious covering. But his interest was chiefly occupied with the curious carving of the frame. This he cleaned as well as he could with a brush, and then he proceeded to a minute examination of its various parts, in the hope of discovering some index to the intention of the carver. In this, however, he was unsuccessful, and at length, pausing with some weariness and disappointment, he gazed vacantly for a few moments into the depth of the reflecting mirror. But ere long he said half aloud, "What a strange thing a mirror is, and what a wondrous affinity exists between it and a man's imagination. For this room of mine, as I behold it in the glass, is the same and yet not the same. It is not the mere representation of the room I live in, but it looks just as if I were reading about it in a story I like. All its commonness is disappeared. The mirror has lifted it out of the region of fact into the realm of art, and the very representing of it to me has clothed with interest that which was otherwise hard to bear. I should like to live in that room if I could only get into it." Scarcely had the half-molded words floated from him as he stood gazing into the mirror, when, striking him as with a flash of amazement that fixed him in his posture, noiseless and unannounced, glided suddenly through the door into the reflected room, with stately motion, yet reluctant and faltering step, the graceful form of a woman, clothed all in white. Her back only was visible as she walked slowly up to the couch in the further end of the room, on which she laid herself wearily, turning towards him a face of unutterable loveliness, in which suffering and dislike and a sense of compulsion strangely mingled with the beauty. He stood without the power of motion for some moments, with his eyes irrecoverably fixed upon her. Even after he was conscious of the ability to move, he could not summon up courage to turn and look on her face to face in the veritable chamber in which he stood. At length, with a sudden effort, in which the exercise of the will was so pure that it seemed involuntary, he turned his face to the couch. It was vacant. In bewilderment mingled with terror, he turned again to the mirror. There, on the reflected couch, lay the exquisite lady. She lay with closed eyes, whence 2 large tears were welling from beneath the veiling lids, still as death, save for the convulsive motion of her bosom. Cosmo himself could not have described what he felt. His emotions were of a kind that destroyed consciousness, and could never be clearly recalled. He could not help standing yet by the mirror and keeping his eyes fixed on the lady, though he was painfully aware of his rudeness, and he feared every moment that she would open hers and meet his fixed regard. But he was, ere long, a little relieved, for after a while her eyelids slowly rose, and her eyes remained uncovered, but unemployed for a time. And when, at length, they began to wander about the room, as if languidly seeking to make some acquaintance with her environment, they were never directed towards him. It seemed nothing but what was in the mirror could affect her vision, and therefore, if she saw him at all, it could only be his back, which, of necessity, was turned towards her in the glass. The 2 figures in the mirror could not meet face to face, except he turned and looked at her present in his room, and, as she was not there, he concluded that if he were to turn towards the part in his room corresponding to that in which she lay, his reflection would be invisible to her altogether. By and by her eyes fell upon the skeleton, and he saw her shudder and close them. She did not open them again, but signs of repugnance continued evident on her countenance. Cosmo would have removed the obnoxious thing at once, but he feared to discompose her yet more by the assertion of his presence, which the act would involve. So he stood and he watched her. The eyelids yet shrouded the eyes, as a costly case the jewels within. The troubled expression gradually faded from the countenance, leaving only a faint sorrow behind. The features settled into an unchanging expression of rest, and by these signs and the slow, regular motion of her breath, Cosmo knew that she slept. He could now gaze on her without embarrassment. He saw that her figure, dressed in the simplest robe of white, was worthy of her face, and so harmonious that either the delicately molded foot or any finger of the equally delicate hand was an index to the whole. As she lay, her whole form manifested the relaxation of perfect repose. He gazed until he was weary, and at last seated himself near the new-found shrine, and mechanically took up a book, like one who watches from a sick bed. But his eyes gathered no thoughts from the pages before him. His intellect had been stunned by the bold contradiction to its face of all its experience, and now lay passive, without assertion or speculation, or even conscious astonishment, while his imagination sent one wild dream of blessedness after another coursing through his soul. How long he sat he knew not, but at length he roused himself, rose, and trembling in every portion of his frame, looked into the mirror. She was gone. The mirror reflected faithfully what his room represented, and nothing more. It stood there like a golden setting whence the central jewel had been stolen away, like a night sky without the glory of its stars. She had carried with her all the strangeness of the reflected room. It had sunk to the level of the one without. And when the first pangs of his disappointment had passed, Cosmo began to comfort himself with the hope that she might return, perhaps the next evening at the same hour, resolving that if she did, she should not at least be scared by the hateful skeleton. He removed that and several other articles of questionable appearance into a recess by the side of the hearth, whence they could not possibly cast any reflection into the mirror. And having made his poor room as tidy as he could, sought the solace of the open sky and of a night wind that had begun to blow, for he could not rest where he was. When he returned, somewhat composed, he could hardly prevail with himself to lie down on his bed, for he could not help feeling as if she had lain upon it, and for him to lie there now would be something like sacrilege. However, weariness prevailed, and laying himself on the couch, dressed as he was, he slept until day. With a beating heart, beating till he could hardly breathe, he stood in dumb hope before the mirror on the following evening. Again, the reflected room shone as through a purple vapor in the gathering twilight. Everything seemed waiting, like himself, for a coming splendor to glorify its poor earthliness with the presence of a heavenly joy. And just as the room vibrated with the stroke of the neighboring church bell announcing the hour of 6, in glided the pale beauty and again laid herself on the couch. Poor Cosmo nearly lost his senses with delight. She was there once more. Her eyes sought the corner where the skeleton had stood, and a faint gleam of satisfaction crossed her face, apparently at seeing it empty. She looked suffering still, but there was less of discomfort expressed in her countenance than there had been the night before. She took more notice of the things about her and seemed to gaze with some curiosity on the strange apparatus standing here and there in her room. At length, however, drowsiness seemed to overtake her, and again she fell asleep. Resolved not to lose sight of her this time, Cosmo watched the sleeping form. Her slumber was so deep and absorbing that a fascinating repose seemed to pass contagiously from her to him as he gazed upon her, and he started as if awakening from a dream when the lady moved and, without opening her eyes, rose and passed from the room with the gait of a somnambulist. Cosmo was now in a state of extravagant delight. Most men have a secret treasure somewhere. The miser has his golden hoard, the virtuoso his pet ring, the student his rare book, the poet his favorite haunt, the lover his secret drawer, but Cosmo had a mirror and a lovely lady in it. And now that he knew by the skeleton that she was affected by the things around her, he had a new object in life. He would turn the bare chamber in the mirror into a room such as no lady need disdain to call her own. This he could effect only by furnishing and adorning his. And Cosmo was poor, yet he possessed accomplishments that he could turn to account, although hitherto he had preferred living on his slender allowance to increasing his means by what his pride considered unworthy of his rank. He was the best swordsman in the university, and now he offered to give lessons in fencing and similar exercises to those as chose to pay him for the trouble. His proposal was heard with surprise by the students, but it was eagerly accepted by many, and soon his instructions were not confined to the richer students, but were anxiously sought by many of the young nobility of Prague and its neighborhood. So that very soon he had a good deal of money at his command. The first thing he did was to remove his apparatus and oddities into a closet in the room. Then he placed his bed and a few other necessities on each side of the hearth and parted them from the rest of the room by 2 screens of Indian fabric. Then he put an elegant couch for the lady to lie upon in the corner where his bed had formerly stood, and by degrees, every day, adding some article of luxury, converted it at length into a rich boudoir. Every night, about the same time, the lady entered. The first time she saw the new couch, she started with a half smile. Then her face grew very sad. The tears came to her eyes, and she laid herself upon the couch and pressed her face into the silken pillows as if to hide from everything. She took notice of each additional and each change as the work proceeded, and a look of acknowledgment as if she knew that someone was ministering to her and was grateful for it, mingled with the constant look of suffering. At length, after she had laid down, as usual one evening, her eyes fell upon some paintings in which Cosmo had just finished adorning the walls. She rose, and to his great delight, walked across the room and proceeded to examine them carefully, testifying much pleasure in her looks as she did so. But again the sorrowful, tearful expression returned, and again she buried her face in the pillows of the couch. Gradually, however, her countenance had grown more composed. Much of the suffering manifest on her first appearance had vanished, and a kind of quiet, hopeful expression had taken its place, which, however, frequently gave way to an anxious, troubled look, mingled with something of sympathetic pity. Meantime, how fared Cosmo? As might be expected in one of his temperament, his interest had blossomed into love, and his love, shall I call it ripened or withered, into passion. But alas, he loved a shadow. He could not come near her, could not speak to her, could not hear a sound from those sweet lips, to which his longing eyes would cling like bees to their honey founts. Ever and anon he sang to himself, "I shall die for love of the maiden." And ever he looked again, and died not, though his heart seemed ready to break with intensity of life and longing. And the more he did for her, the more he loved her, and he hoped that although she never appeared to see him, yet she was pleased to think that an unknown would give his life to her. He tried to comfort himself over his separation from her by thinking that perhaps someday she would see him and make signs to him, and that would satisfy him, for, thought he, is not this all that a loving soul can do to enter in communion with another? Nay, how many who love never come nearer than to behold each other as in a mirror, seem to know and yet never know the inward life, never enter the soul, and part at last with but the vaguest notion of the universe on the borders of which they have been hovering for years. If I could but speak to her and knew that she heard me, I should be satisfied. Once he contemplated painting a picture on the wall, which should of necessity convey to the lady a thought of himself, but, though he had some skill with the pencil, he found his hand trembled so much when he began the attempt that he was forced to give it up. Chapter 2. Who lives he dies, who dies he is alive. One evening, as he stood gazing on his treasure, he thought he saw a faint expression of self-consciousness on her countenance, as if she surmised that passionate eyes were fixed upon her. This grew till at last the red blood rose over her neck and cheek and brow. Cosmo, longing to approach her, became almost delirious. This night she was dressed in an evening costume resplendent with diamonds. This could add nothing to her beauty, but it presented it in a new aspect, enabling her loveliness to make a new manifestation of itself in a new embodiment. Diamonds glittered from amidst her hair, half hidden in its luxuriance like stars through dark rain clouds, and the bracelets on her white arms flashed all the colors of the rainbow of lightnings as she lifted her snowy hands to cover her burning face. But her beauty shone down all its adornments. If I might have but one of her feet to kiss, thought Cosmo, I should be content. Alas, he deceived himself, for passion is never content. Nor did he know that there are 2 ways out of her enchanted house. But suddenly, as if the pang had been driven into his heart from without, revealing itself first in pain, and afterwards in definite form, the thought darted into his mind. She has a lover somewhere. Remembered words of his bring the color on her face now. I am nowhere to her. She lives in another world all day, and all night after she leaves me. Why does she come and make me love her, till I, a strong man, am too faint to look upon her more? He looked again, and her face was pale as a lily. A sorrowful compassion seemed to rebuke the glitter of the restless jewels, and the slow tears rose in her eyes. She left her room sooner this evening than was her wont. Cosmo remained alone, with a feeling as if his bosom had been suddenly left empty and hollow, and the weight of the whole world was crushing in its walls. The next evening, for the first time since she began to come, she came not. And now Cosmo was in a wretched plight. Since the thought of arrival had occurred to him, he could not rest for a moment. More than ever, he longed to see the lady face to face. He persuaded himself that if he but knew the worst, he would be satisfied, for then he could abandon Prague and find that relief in constant motion, which is the hope of all active minds when invaded by distress. Meantime, he waited with unspeakable anxiety for the next night, hoping she would return, but she did not appear, and now he really fell ill. Rallied by his fellow students on his wretched looks, he ceased to attend the lectures. His engagements were neglected. He cared for nothing. The sky, with the great sun in it, was to him a heartless, burning desert. The men and women in the street were mere puppets without motives in themselves or interest to him. He saw them all as on the ever-changing field of a camera obscura. She alone and altogether was his universe, his well of life, his incarnate good. For 6 evenings she came not. Let his absorbing passion and the slow fever that was consuming his brain be his excuse for the resolution which he had taken and begun to execute before that time had expired. Reasoning with himself that it must be by some enchantment connected with the mirror that the form of the lady was to be seen in it, he determined to attempt to turn to account for what he hitherto studied principally from curiosity. For, he said to himself, if a spell can force her presence in that glass, and she came unwillingly at first, may not a stronger spell, such as I know, especially with the aid of her half-presence in the mirror, if ever she appears again, compel her living form to come to me here? If I do her wrong, let love be my excuse. I want only to know my doom from her own lips. He never doubted all the time that she was a real earthly woman, or rather that there was a woman who, somehow or other, threw this reflection of her form into the magic mirror. He opened the secret drawer and took out his books of magic, lighted his lamps, and read and made notes from midnight till 3 a.m. for 3 successive nights. Then he replaced his books, and the next night went out in quest of the materials necessary for the conjuration. These were not easy to find, for in love charms and all incantations of this nature, ingredients are employed scarcely fit to be mentioned, and for the thought even of which, in connection with her, he could only excuse himself on the score of his bitter need. At length he succeeded in procuring all he required, and on the 7th evening from that on which she had last appeared, he found himself prepared for the exercise of unlawful and tyrannical power, magic. He cleared the center of the room, stooped, and drew a circle of red on the floor around the spot where he stood, wrote in the 4 quarters mystical signs and the numbers, which were all powers of 7 or 9, examined the whole ring carefully to see that no smallest break had occurred in the circumference, then rose from his bending posture. As he rose, the church clock struck 7, and just as she had appeared the first time, reluctantly, slowly, and stately, glided into the room. Cosmo trembled, and when turning, she revealed a countenance worn and wan, as with sickness or inward trouble. He grew faint, and felt as if he dared not proceed. But as he gazed on the face and form, which now possessed his whole soul to the exclusion of all other joys and griefs, the longing to speak to her, to know that she heard him, to hear from her one word in return became so unendurable that he suddenly and hastily resumed his preparations. Stepping carefully from the circle, he put a small brazier into its center. He then set fire to its contents of charcoal, and while it burned up, opened his window and seated himself, waiting beside it. It was a sultry evening. The air was full of thunder. A sense of luxurious depression filled his brain. The sky seemed to have grown heavy and to compress the air beneath it. A kind of purplish tinge pervaded the atmosphere, and through the open window came the sense of distant fields, which all the vapors of the city could not quench. Soon the charcoal glowed. Cosmo sprinkled upon it the incense and other substances which he had compounded, and stepping within the circle, turned his face from the brazier and toward the mirror. Then fixing his eyes upon the face of the lady, he began with a trembling voice to repeat a powerful incantation. He had not gone far before the lady grew pale, and then, like a returning wave, the blood washed all its banks from its crimson tide, and she hid her face in her hands. Then he passed to a conjuration stronger yet. The lady rose and walked uneasily to and fro in her room. Another spell, and she seemed seeking with her eyes for some object on which they wished to rest. At length it seemed as if she suddenly espied him, for her eyes fixed themselves full and wide upon his, and she drew gradually and somewhat unwillingly close to her side of the mirror, just as if his eyes had fascinated her. Cosmo had never seen her so near before. Now, at least, eyes met eyes. But he could not quite understand the expression of hers. They were full of tender entreaty, but there was something more that he could not interpret. Though his heart seemed to labor in his throat, he could allow no delight or agitation to turn him from his task. Looking still in her face, he passed on to the mightiest charm he knew. Suddenly the lady turned and walked out of the door of her reflected chamber. A moment after, she entered his room with veritable presence, and forgetting all his precautions, he sprang from the charmed circle and knelt before her. There she stood, the living lady of his passionate visions, alone beside him, in a thundery twilight and the glow of a magic fire. "Why," said the lady with a trembling voice, didst thou bring a poor maiden through the rainy streets alone?" "Because I am dying for love of thee. But I only brought thee from the mirror here." "Ah, the mirror!" And she looked up at it and shuddered. "Alas, I am but a slave while that mirror exists. But do not think it was the power of thy spells that drew me here. It was thy longing desire to see me that beat at the door of my heart till I was forced to yield." "Canst thou love me, then?" said Cosmo, in a voice calm as death, but almost inarticulate with emotion. "I do not know," she replied sadly. "That I cannot tell, so long as I am bewildered with enchantments. It were indeed a joy too great to lay my head on thy bosom and weep to death, for I think thou lovest me, though I do not know, but—" Cosmo rose from his knees. "I love thee as, nay, I know not what, for since I have loved thee, there is nothing else." He seized her hand. She withdrew it. "No, better not. I am in thy power, and therefore I may not." She burst into tears, and kneeling before him, in turn, said, "Cosmo, if thou lovest me, set me free, even from thyself. Break the mirror, and shall I see thyself instead? I cannot tell. I will not deceive you. We may never meet again." A fierce struggle arose in Cosmo's breast. Now she was in his power. She did not dislike him, at least, and he could see her when he would. To break the mirror would be to destroy his very life, to banish out his universe, to banish out of his universe the only glory it possessed. The whole world would be but a prison if he annihilated the one window that looked into the paradise of love. Not yet pure in love, he hesitated. With a wail of sorrow, the lady rose to her feet. "Ah, he loves me not, even as I love him, and alas, I care more for his love than even for the freedom I ask." "I will not wait to be willing," cried Cosmo, and sprang to the corner where the great sword stood. Meantime, it had grown very dark. Only the embers cast a red glow through the room. He seized the sword by the steel scabbard and stood before the mirror. But as he heaved a great blow at it with the heavy pommel, the blade slipped halfway out of the scabbard and the pommel struck the wall above the mirror. At that moment, a terrible clap of thunder seemed to burst into the very room beside them, and ere Cosmo could repeat the blow, he fell senseless on the hearth. When he came to himself, he found that the lady and the mirror had both disappeared. He was seized with a brain fever, which kept him on his couch for weeks. When he recovered his reason, he began to think what could have become of the mirror. For the lady, he hoped she had found her way back as she came, but as the mirror involved her fate with its own, he was more immediately anxious about that. He could not think that she had carried it away. It was much too heavy, even if it had not been too firmly fixed to the wall for her to remove it. Then again he remembered the thunder, which had made him believe that it was not the lightning, but some other blow that had struck him down. He concluded that, either by supernatural agency, he having exposed himself to the vengeance of the demons by leaving the circle of safety, or in some other mode, the mirror had probably found its way back to its former owner, and, horrible to think, might have been by this time once more disposed of, delivering up the lady into the power of another man, who, if he used his power no worse than he himself had done, might yet give Cosmo abundant cause to curse the selfish indecision which prevented him from shattering the mirror at once. Indeed, to think that she whom he loved, and who had prayed to him for freedom, should still be at the mercy, in some degree, of the possessor of the mirror, and was at least exposed to his constant observation, was in itself enough to madden a cherry lover. Anxiety to be well retarded his recovery, but at length he was able to creep abroad. He first made his way to the old broker's, pretending to be in search of something else. A laughing sneer on the creature's face convinced him that he knew all about it, but he could not see it among the furniture, or get any information out of him as to what had become of it. He expressed his utmost surprise at hearing it had been stolen, a surprise which Cosmo saw at once to be counterfeit, while at the same time he fancied that the old wretch was not at all anxious to have it mistaken for genuine. Full of distress, which he concealed as well as he could, he made many searches, but with no avail. Of course, he could ask no questions, but he kept his ears awake for any remotest hint that might set him in a direction of search. He never went out without a short, heavy hammer of steel about him, that he might shatter the mirror the moment he was made happy by the sight of his lost treasure, if ever that blessed moment should arrive. Whether he should see the lady again was now a thought altogether secondary, and postponed to the achievement of her freedom. He wandered here and there like an anxious ghost, pale and haggard, gnawed ever at the heart by the thought of what she might be suffering, all from his fault. One night he mingled with a crowd that filled the rooms of one of the most distinguished mansions in the cities, for he accepted every invitation, that he might lose no chance, however poor, of obtaining some information that might expedite his recovery. Here he wandered about, listening to every stray word that he could catch, in the hope of a revelation. As he approached some ladies who were talking in a corner, one said to another, "Have you heard of the strange illness of the Princess Van Hohenweiss?"
"Yes, she has been ill for more than a year now. It's very sad for so fine a creature to have such a terrible malady. She was better for some weeks lately, but within the last few days, the same attacks have returned, apparently accompanied with more suffering than ever. It is altogether an inexplicable story."
"Is there a story connected with her illness?"
"I have only heard imperfect reports of it, but it is said that she gave offense some 18 months ago to an old woman who had held an office of trust in the family, and who, after some incoherent threats, disappeared. This peculiar affection followed soon after, but the strangest part of the story is its association with the loss of an antique mirror which stood in her dressing room, and of which she constantly made use." Here the speaker's voice sank to a whisper, and Cosmo, although his very soul sat listening to his ears, could hear no more. He trembled too much to dare to address the ladies, even if it had been advisable to expose himself to their curiosity.
The name of the princess was well known to him, but he had never seen her, except, indeed, it was she, which now he hardly doubted, who had knelt before him on that dreadful night. Fearful of attracting attention, for from the weak state of his health he could not recover an appearance of calmness, he made his way to the open air and reached his lodgings, glad in this that he at least knew where she lived, although he never dreamed of approaching her openly, even if he should be happy enough to free her from her hateful bondage. He hoped, too, that, as he had unexpectedly learned so much, the other and far more important part might be revealed to him ere long. "Have you seen Steinway lately?" "No, I have not seen him for some time. He's almost a match for me at rapier. I suppose he thinks he needs no more lessons." "I wonder what has become of him. I want to see him very much. Let me see. The last time I saw him, he was coming out of an old broker's den, to which, if you remember, you accompanied once to look at some armor. That is fully 3 weeks ago." This hint was enough for Cosmo. Von Steinwald was a reckless man of influence in the court, well known for his reckless habits and fierce passions. The very possibility that the mirror should be in his possession was hell itself to Cosmo. But violent or hasty measures of any sort were most unlikely to succeed. All that he wanted was an opportunity of breaking the fatal glass, and to obtain this he must bide his time. He revolved many plans in his mind, but without being able to fix upon any. At length, one evening, as he was passing the house of von Steinwald, he saw the windows more than usually brilliant. He watched for a while, and seeing that company began to arrive, hastened home and dressed as richly as he could, in the hope of mingling with the guests unquestioned, in effecting which there could be no difficulty for a man of Cosmo's carriage. In a lofty, silent chamber in another part of the city lay a form more like marble than a living woman. The loveliness of death seemed frozen upon her face, for her lips were livid and her eyelids were closed. Her long white hands were crossed over her breast, and no breathing disturbed their repose. Beside the dead, men speak in whispers, as if the deepest rest of all could be broken by the sound of a living voice. Just so, though the soul was evidently beyond the reach of all intimations from the senses, the two ladies who sat beside her spoke in the gentlest tones of subdued sorrow. "She has lain so for an hour. This cannot last long, I fear. How much thinner she has grown within the last few weeks. If she would only speak and explain what she suffers, it would be better for her. I think she has visions in her trances, but nothing can induce her to refer to them when she is awake." "Does she ever speak in these trances?" "I have never heard her, but they say she walks sometimes, and once put the whole household in a terrible fright by disappearing in a rainstorm for a whole hour, and returning drenched and almost dead with exhaustion and fright. But even then, she would give no account of what had happened." A scarce audible murmur from the yet motionless lips of the lady here startled her attendants. After several ineffectual attempts at articulation, the word "Cosmo" burst from her. Then she lay still as before, but only for a moment. With a wild cry, she sprang from the couch, erect on the floor, flung her arms above her head with clasped and straining hands, and her wide eyes flashing with light, called aloud, with a voice exultant as that of a spirit bursting from a sepulchre, "I'm free! I'm free! I thank thee!" Then she flung herself on the couch and sobbed, then rose and paced wildly up and down the room with gestures of mingled delight and anxiety. Then turning to her emotionless attendants, "Quick, Lisa, my cloak and hood." Then lower, "I must go to him. Make haste, Lisa. You may come with me if you will." In another moment they were in the street, hurrying along towards one of the bridges over the Moldau. The moon was near the zenith, and the streets were almost empty. The princess soon outstripped her attendant, and was halfway over the bridge before the other reached it. "Are you free, lady? The mirror is broken. Are you free?" The words were spoken close beside her. As she hurried on, she turned, and there, leaning on the parapet in a recess of the bridge, stood Cosmo, in a splendid dress, but with a white and quivering face. "Cosmo, I am free, and thy servant forever. I was coming to you now." "And I to you, for death made me bold, but I could get no further. Have I atoned at all? Do I love you a little truly?" "Ah, I know now that you love me, my Cosmo. But what do you say about death?" He did not reply. His hand was pressed against his side. She looked more closely. The blood was welling from between the fingers. She flung her arms around him with a faint, bitter wail. When Lisa came up, she found her mistress kneeling above the wan face which smiled on in the spectral moonbeams. The end of what I called The Mirror, Chapter 8 of Phantastes by George MacDonald. I'm a little bit over my time, but I'm just going to say a couple more things. It's a little bit of a sad story, of course, because it's quite sad that Cosmo dies at the end, but he dies smiling. It's beautiful, which is lovely, for he fulfilled his great purpose to bring freedom to his great love. And of course, we can hear the echoes of the love story that God has for us in this. The watching and the longing, and that he loves her, even though she can't even see him. She doesn't even see him. She can see the little things that he does for her in the room. She can see it when he takes out the skeleton. She can see it when he makes the room more beautiful for her, but she can't see him. She doesn't know his name. She doesn't know him at all, and yet he loves her. And he cares for her, and he becomes consumed and absorbed with the idea of loving her and caring for her. And then, of course, in the end of bringing her freedom, which he brings her through his death. And that is the same way that God loves us. Even when we can't see him, even when we don't know him, even when we can't hear his voice, can't look him back in the eyes, he is seeing us, and he is reaching out to you. He is trying through little means to show you that he is there, and that he is concerned with your life, and that he wants you to know him and to be able to turn and look into his eyes and to see that great love there. And of course, if you don't know already, of course, he was also willing to die to break the curse over your life, to break that curse of wrongdoing that all of us is in. None of us can help it. We all fall short. We all do wrong things that we shouldn't do. But God said, I don't want to have to punish them and separate them from myself. I want them to be in heaven with me in a perfect place. And so I'm willing to take that punishment for them. I'm willing to die to take that curse away so that they can be in heaven with me. And that's the reason that Cosmo dies smiling in the moonlight, because that freedom, it was worth the death. And that's how Jesus felt when he died on that cross. The freedom that he was bringing to you and to me was worth the death. The good news is Jesus did not stay dead. He rose again in 3 days. He is alive. The Bible tells us he sits at the right hand of God. He is God, and he prays for us. So the longing for us continues, and the love for us continues. So it's just as simple as saying yes to him. It's just as simple as repenting, turning from that wrongdoing and saying, yes, I want you. But what's really important, I think, to remember is that it's not easy to follow Christ. It's not an easy thing. Sometimes we act like, oh, yeah, okay, there's going to be joy and there's going to be goodness. And he does do wonderful things for us, like bringing in that beautiful couch and the silk screen and the beautiful pictures that Cosmo brought for her. But there's still pain when we follow him. And this is how George MacDonald ends his book. I wanted to read you the whole last paragraph because I thought it was so beautiful, but let me just read you the last few lines. He says, I know that good is coming to me, that good is always coming. Though few have it at all times, the simplicity and the courage to believe it. What we call evil is the only and best shape which, for the person and his condition at the time, could be assumed by the best good. So that's what we have to know when we have Christ. Life is not always good. Life is hard. The Bible says, in the world you will have tribulation, but this is what we have to know. We have to know that good is coming, that good is always coming, and that the things that we call evil, that are dark and that are hard, is only the and best shape, which for me and for you in our current condition are going to turn into the very best good. I know that good is coming. I know that good is always coming. And even if that's just the good of being in heaven, being in perfection, being in that place that our souls have been longing for since we were small children, we know that good is coming. And that's what we have to hold on to. No matter how dark the long winter of our lives, the long winter of this world, the good is coming. And you don't want to miss it. You want to be made right with God because you don't want to miss it, because the opposite is too dark to think about. And that is separation from God. And that if this world is bad, where God is not fully but present like he will be in heaven, but God is here, imagine the world without him. It's unthinkable. All right, that's all I got for you tonight. Thank you so much for listening. I sure appreciate you tuning in. I hope that some of this has called to your heart a little bit, because I know that God loves you so very, very much. I'll be on next week. You'll have a great week, and I'll be back for our hearts and minds to be fertile ground. Until then, bless you.